God has specifically chosen you to be here at this time and in this place. You have incredible potential, purpose, and calling to push back the darkness and be a light for Christ. Stand for nothing and you'll fall for anything. It's time to stand your ground. This is Unapologetic. Welcome to Unapologetic. Today, I'm so excited to welcome the Daystar Counseling Ministries Director of Family Counseling, David Thomas, to the show. We are talking about how to raise boys, how to raise them emotionally healthy, spiritually healthy, and what we can be doing now as parents to help prepare them for the future. David has been with Daystar Christian Counseling Center in Nashville for over 25 years. He's also a best-selling author, sought-after speaker, whose latest book, Raising Emotionally Strong Boys, came out earlier this year. We're going to talk about the book and how to do just that, raise emotionally strong boys who love the Lord and who can step fully into their calling. We are so glad to have you on the show today, David. Thanks for being here.
Hi, I'm so grateful to be with you. Been looking so forward to this.
I'm so excited. We had Sissy on a few weeks ago, and we did a whole just episode with her about girls. And so I'm excited today to talk about boys. What are we supposed to do in raising boys? But before we get into that, I'm going to ask you what I ask all my guests. What do you wish Christians would stop apologizing for?
It's a great question. You know, I would say, in thinking about the work that I do, I talk so much about how kids learn more from observation than information. They learn way more from watching us than hearing from us. And I would say, in light of that and in response to your question, I wish that Christians would apologize less for not representing Christ in this world and do more of that. Like, just be thinking, what does it look like to live out this relationship that we prioritize and believe in so strongly and want our kids to embody? So I would say that would be my response to that. That fits so much within the work I do. And where, I talk about in my newest book that I don't think we can take the kids we love farther than we've gone ourselves. And so I talk so much about regulation in this book, and I challenge parents by saying, if you struggle with regulation, it's going to be really hard for your kids to get a sense of what that looks like on the grown-ups they trust the most in this world.
Okay, so I love when we talk about psychological things, but a lot of times we do have to talk about definitions. Like, what do you mean by regulation?
Yes. I start out in this book by talking about what I call the 3 R's. And the first R is recognize, which is just paying attention to the signs and signals our body gives us when we're having an emotional response. I often teach it to kids kind of like the dashboard on a car. You know how our car will signal us if the tire needs air or the tank is low and it needs gas. And then sometimes it gives us a greater signal like a check engine light. And if we pay attention to those signs and signals, then the car keeps running efficiently, effectively. The same is true with our bodies. But if we ignore those things, we can do some real damage to the vehicle or to ourselves. And so that's the first R. The second R is regulate, which is to employ calming strategies when the nervous system goes into this heightened state of arousal. And so it's really based on, there's a passage in Philippians that I love, that I put in the book, that I love in particular, Eugene Peterson, who we lost a couple of years ago, who created the message. I loved his version of Philippians 4 in this way. He says, "Don't fret or worry. Instead of worrying, pray. Let petitions and praises shape your worries into prayers, letting God know your concerns. Before you know it, a sense of God's wholeness, everything coming together for good, will come and settle you down."
Wow.
And so when I think about that language of settle you down, that's what I think regulation is about. Like, how do I move myself from stress to settled, or from chaos to calm? And what are the particular strategies that I need to employ so that can happen?
And I think, just for moms listening, because I talk with my friends about this a lot, because we all do this. It's not blaming anyone's parents. Like, I told my husband the other day, I was like, one day the triplets are all going to get together on lunch and try to just analyze you and I as parents. It's not just going to happen one time. So give grace to your parents, because you're gonna want it too. But I've talked to my friends about this a lot, that are moms with little kids, because you have to identify what you want to change, and you have to identify things in your own life. So I know something that my parents would often catastrophize. Like it was like, don't run into the street because, and it's like the worst possible scenario. And so, which granted, I never, had any accidents by God's grace and probably by the fear from my parents. But I remember the first time with the triplets where I started to think about, like I almost started to say something that would have caused probably more anxiety than healthy fear. And it's just those things, like I remember consciously deciding to change it. I was like, okay, I'm not going to do that. Even though it did keep me safe. Like, is there a way to do this in a non-anxiety causing way? And I told you before we started, like one of God's biggest graces to me was becoming a therapist before going from 0 to 3 kids overnight that are all fraternal with all completely different giftings and personalities and demeanors and temperaments. But can you just help the listener, like who doesn't know, like what are these things? How am I displaying anxiety? What things should I not say in front of my kids, especially in front of boys?
Well, and I'm right there with you. You and I were laughing together before we hit record. My firstborn is a girl, and then about a year into her life, we got pregnant for the second time. We're incredibly grateful, went for our ultrasound midway, and walked into that room, said to the technician, okay, we're really old school. We don't want to know what we're having. We were surprised, didn't know my daughter was a girl till the day she was born. So make a note in the chart, but don't tell us. And I can still remember where I was standing in that room when the technician looked up and said, I see 2 heads.
Yeah.
And I remember thinking, then why are you smiling if the baby has 2 heads? That did not sound right to me at all. We were that shocked. Like my wife had not gained extra weight. Her counts weren't different. None of the indicators that are there when you're carrying multiples were there for us. So here we were finding this out midway through. And that, as you and I both know, multiples always come early. And so at that point I said, okay, well, clearly we're so behind. I do need to know. So I'm going to lay down right now. And then you tell us what we're having. So you and I share that journey, even as I love the way you talked about that, because even as I'm talking about these things, like I'm practicing these things on the regular, and I was needing to more than ever when my kids were in that younger space. And so something you said that I think is of such importance to go back to, the anxiety research would tell us that anxious parents, without knowing this is happening sometimes, can use more catastrophic language. So we'll say things like, instead of saying, oh, that sounds hard, we'll say, that sounds terrible. That's the worst thing. And our response sometimes out of our own anxiety can generate some anxiety on behalf of our kids that wasn't there in the first place. So we talk so often in our practice with parents consistently about, the greatest gift that you could give to anxious kids is to attend to your own anxiety. It really is. And that's where I believe, practicing these R's starts with us and moves toward our kids, that's got to be our starting point, again, to that first question, so that we can model it, so that our kids can sit front row and see what that looks like on the grownups they trust the most in this world.
And I think that you and I, of course, have the benefit of being in this field, and something that happens with counselors whenever we're trying many years of getting licensed is that you have people that give you feedback. So just what that sounds like is like, I would have to ask my colleagues, how do you perceive me? And they would have to tell me that. But a lot of people, that's not a normal situation. Most people do not walk around with their friends telling them, I perceive you as anxious, or I perceive you as angry, or, and we don't really value everybody's opinion. We can value it, but we're not going to take it to heart. Do you have just suggestions on how to get that kind of feedback? Because a lot of people I know that are anxious, I don't think they know they are. And so they don't have really that awareness that could be passing on to their kids.
I agree with you wholeheartedly. In fact, the current stats tell us that girls are twice as likely to struggle. And if we know that to be true, what that would mean is that, I'm going to challenge moms for a minute, then I'm going to challenge dads listening. What that would mean is that there are a lot of adult women in this world who are struggling with anxiety where it may not have been identified or diagnosed, or, as you just said, even noticed. And I would argue, if you're a person who bends strongly toward control, there is a great likelihood you may be struggling. If you're a person who tends to, when things are, chaotic in some way, get really rigid and inflexible, highly efficient, productive. Again, a little bit of it can be great, a lot of it not so great. And so I would argue, I think there are a lot of adult women in the world who are operating with some anxiety and not aware. I would argue there are a lot of adult men in the world who are operating with some depression.
Absolutely.
And I talk in the book about how depression with males does not look the traditional way. Our traditional understanding is that it's more sad, lethargic, unmotivated. And I'd argue there are a lot of depressed men in this world who are going to work every single day. They're getting out of bed, but they have this low-grade irritability. They have a kind of a chronic anger that is, again, something we don't often think about when we think about depression. But on males, depression often looks more angry than sad. And so I think there are a lot of grown-ups in the world who are operating from those places who'd benefit from getting some extra support, which is part of why I love that you are putting a spotlight on this conversation through this podcast. Thank you.
Well, I choose the conversations because I was talking to my husband about it yesterday. I read a great quote and it said, you need to learn as many lessons vicariously as possible. And having all of our children the same age, we're looking back because we're kind of closing a chapter right now. And we're like, what do we wish we'd already known? Like, we don't want to learn everything in real time, like, because we're only doing this one time, we think. So we can't really just say, oh, I guess I'll just learn as I go. So I want to switch gears real quick here because just to make sure we have enough time to really specifically talk about boys. And so I want to ask you something, and I don't have a firm opinion on it, but I know kind of the classic thinking is that boys and girls are super different because of their gender. And I know just from my experience, I know very emotional boys and very closed off girls. And to me, it seems a little bit more like individual personalities. Like our triplets do not fit into any stereotype of probably decades ago how we saw boys and girls. But I still hear people say things like, oh, boys don't show emotions and girls blah, blah, blah. Like, is that true? Or is it based on personalities and experiences, nature and nurture?
I'm so glad for you to ask this because I don't think we can be talking enough, thinking enough about this reality. And the reality is there is just no science to back up girls being more emotional and boys being less. In fact, there's even some research that talks about how boys on the front side of development are actually a little more emotionally expressive. Mm-hmm. And what happens is we end up parenting them in a way that moves boys away from that and moves girls more toward that. And so there's fascinating research. I share a little of that in my book about the ways we do that on the front side of development when we're not even aware that dads oftentimes will roughhouse with boys a little more and moms will work sometimes to control a boy's emotional volatility where we would invite or allow more of that with girls. And then what happens is, around 16 months at well visits, pediatricians would tell us that girls are saying about 100 words. Boys are saying about 30. So if she has more words, understandably, she's going to likely have a more expansive emotional vocabulary. And then if we jump forward about a little less than a decade later, somewhere around 9 to 10, boys will begin to channel all primary emotions, fear, sadness, confusion, disappointment into anger. We're right back where we were just talking about. And so boys have all these processes in place that I think invite them less into that space, which is where I think we end up along those lines of thinking. And then the last thing I'd say to that is, I have written some about what I call gendered emotions in the new book, where the other thing we're doing as parents sometimes when we're not aware is asking girls how they feel about something and asking boys what they think or what they did. We ask boys what they did in their day. We ask girls how they felt about what they did. And we need to pay really close attention to that because we want to be asking the girls we love, what do you think in addition to what do you feel? And the boys, what do you feel in addition to what you think? So there are all these biological and cultural processes in play that I think feed and fuel that phenomena, which is why I think it's just so important to talk about.
So for those listening and you're just like, oh man, like where do I even start with this? I just want to give this example because raising 3 kids the exact same age that are completely different. temperament wise. And just an example of stress. So like when our family, if there's stress, like we have a rule that it's calm going to church on Sunday mornings, which is not calm because Ryan and I both work on Sunday mornings and it's game day, but I want them to have a good association with church and with family, and that church is not work. It is a privilege and it's something that our family goes to. So Ryan and I are trying to like keep it so calm as we go to church while, we're like ducks paddling underneath. But whenever there is stress or anything in our home, just to be super practical and give you a picture of this to our audience, one of ours is very much a people pleaser. And so they're trying to figure out, how can I solve the problem? And is mom okay? Is dad okay? One of ours is very calm, and the stress makes that one recede, and they just kind of go off by themselves, and they need to calm, like they do not enjoy the stress. And so they lay down and try to calm themselves. And then the other one that is more aggressive, it's like the aggression starts rising. So you see it physically doing something different, and they're all trying to do something that relieves their stress. So someone that's more laid back is trying to go escape. Someone that's more aggressive is getting more aggressive. And then someone that's more people pleasing and probably anxious in the long run is trying to make sure everyone else is okay. And something that we've started doing is I've started writing down things I notice about them, because I can only imagine, people tell me it only gets busier. And 10 years from now, I want to remember how they acted when they were children, because so many times, having worked with teenagers for so long, it's hard to sift through, what do they do and why are they acting this way? And so if you can remember those core personality traits, I think it gives you some perspective. Do you see that?
I love the wisdom you were bringing to your kids, and the intentionality of saying, I talk about it as becoming a student of the kids we've been given, and the way you're studying them, their hardwiring and their response to experiencing stress, which every child is going to experience with us, outside of us. And the beauty of what you're describing is learning, how do they navigate that? How do I lean into that? How do I help them develop even more healthy coping strategies over the course of their development, in light of that being their natural bent? And I love that you shared that story. I would want to encourage any parent listening to lean into the wisdom of that. And that really is our job. I love that old Experiencing God study that came out many years ago, where, it was like, what is God already doing that we can come alongside? I think that's a great definition of parenting. How's he hardwired these amazing beings, and how can I come alongside that in a way to study and parent in tandem with the unique way that God hardwired our kids? Because you and I both know, having multiples, it is just fascinating to me that we pour the exact same genetic ingredients in, and the outcome is so profoundly different.
Interesting.
It is fascinating, isn't it?
It really, it's really amazing. There are two things I want to make sure that we get to. Can you just explain what traditionally, it's hard because people are different, so I hate to ask this question this way, but anger, anxiety, stress, depression, what does that look like in boys? And the reason we're talking about it is not only because of your great book on it, but I used to do suicide prevention in high schools. That was my first speaking job, and I would go into high schools and do that. And I know that you're passionate about how much men struggle with suicide. And so can you just speak to that? And then just, how do we know? How do we know if our boys are depressed?
I am passionate about that. Thank you for allowing me to talk about it, because adolescent males and adult men lead the stats in that space. And that's terrifying to me as someone who has devoted so much of his work to understanding and supporting boys. But, it's interesting. Adult men lead some of the scariest stats out there: infidelity, internet pornography, substance abuse, suicide, and the common denominator in all those being a male's attempt to try to suppress whatever it is that they're feeling. It's like, I don't want to feel it. I'm going to try to numb it out in some way. And so that's part of why I wrote this book. If on the front side of development, we can really move in a different direction with boys, teaching them, modeling for them what it looks like to identify how they feel and how to navigate those emotions, That's the game. That's really the whole focus of this book. And so I think in my ideal world, it really can start on the front side of development, much to what we described, saying, okay, if this is culturally kind of how we respond to boys, how could we reverse some of that? How could we be asking boys from the front side of development more of what they feel in addition to what they think and what they did? So I think it begins in that space. And then also, to your great question, understanding that the presentation of those things will often look different. And so interestingly enough, anxious boys in a classroom often look fidgety, restless, inattentive, and impulsive. Those are the very things we think about when we think about ADHD. I can't tell you how many boys I've seen over the years who've been misdiagnosed with ADHD who had an undercurrent of anxiety, and boys we miss depression with because it didn't, as we mentioned earlier, look sad or lethargic, but it looks angry and irritable. I had a mom of an adolescent boy years ago say, it's like he wakes up every day with this low-grade chronic irritability, like he's just mad at the world. And that is a clear marker of depression oftentimes with adolescent males, and where we, again, just don't want to miss the signs and signals.
And adult
absolutely,
men as well.
Absolutely, absolutely. So thank you for putting a spotlight on that, because I do think it's part of how it gets missed, our lack of understanding in that space.
So I know I'm so thankful that it's not as hidden or taboo to go to therapy anymore. But I think a lot of people wonder, like, when should we start seeing someone? When should we start seeing a therapist? And I was just with a friend who is having a huge trauma in her life. It has nothing to do. I mean, it's not sin. Like, she didn't do anything wrong. Like, it's just, this is what God has chosen for her at this time. And so her proactive approach, like, she just immediately got in therapy so that she has someone. She knows this is too big, the situation's too big, and she wants to make sure that she has someone that she's processing with and someone outside that can identify what's going on. And so I know, like, that's my personal opinion. Like, if tomorrow, hopefully nothing like this will happen, but if tomorrow there was some huge tragedy or trauma in our family, like, we would just all immediately be in therapy, just to make sure that everyone's okay and processing, not they'd be okay. So I know if there's any huge thing like divorce or any, a death or something really big T trauma, you would just, we would suggest that everybody go just to check in. Yes. But what about like just normal everyday life, and you're just starting to notice changes in your kids? Because you've already said it's hard to identify in boys. How would you know if you needed professional help for your children?
I would advise any parent listening who has some questions around what they're observing with their kids and wondering, is this something I should be more concerned about? Is this normal to development? Is this just a passage, say, from late childhood into early adolescence, and my kid feels really different? To put another set of eyes on it. And that could be a consultation with your pediatrician where you go in without kids, or call over to get some feedback, someone who has trained in that space of understanding the pediatric population. Or one of the things we do in our practice is offer what we call parent consultations. We do them with parents all over the country by Zoom or by phone. And it's where parents will just come into conversation with us and say, hey, I've got these 3 or 4 questions. Does this sound concerning? Or do you have any thoughts on how we could create a to-do list to best support a child who's responding in this way? And again, just putting another set of eyes on the equation to allow someone who's specialized in serving the pediatric population to really think it through with you. One of the things I would also say lastly in response to that question is, one of the reasons when I wrote this parenting book that I wanted to write a workbook to go alongside it was to be a tool for parents to begin that journey themselves with kids. And so my dear friend and colleague, Sissy Goff, who you mentioned, who you've talked with, wrote a great workbook for girls called Braver, Stronger, Smarter. And when she gave it to me to edit and read, I said to her, Sissy, you were giving away like 3 months of free counseling. And she said, I know, and I'm thrilled about it because, for both of us with these workbooks, if we could kind of work ourselves out of a job, we're okay with that because we're putting resources in parents' hands to say, and that's so much what Strong and Smart, the workbook for boys is for me, of a tool for parents to start that journey of building these emotional muscles on the front side of development, pre-12, so that there's a possibility I won't be needed at some point along the way, or someone who does my work. But if it is, to your great point, let's access it. As a parent, we always want to err on the side of too much support rather than too little when it comes to concerns of where kids are struggling. And I think the pandemic has reminded us of that more than any. We just don't want to miss anything.
I just want to say, because we talk a lot about Christian counseling on here, if you're struggling to think how spiritual is this? The verse that God gave me when I was doing primarily suicide prevention work was John 10:10. The thief, Satan, comes to steal, kill, and destroy. But Jesus has come that they may have life and have it to the fullest. So depression, anxiety, suicide, that's all a matter of life and death. So that is ministering to your kids, getting them, if they are struggling so much emotionally that they cannot do their life, you're literally fighting for their life in their eternal life, especially if they haven't accepted Christ. And so just realizing this isn't a separate thing. It all goes together. We have anxious kids that can't come to student ministry events. I mean, they need help. And so realizing it really does impact their spiritual life. And I remember learning that it was that anxious Christians and depressed Christians, the first thing they say is, I don't feel God anymore. And of course, God hasn't left, but just different things happen in your brain that make it hard, not impossible, but hard really to obey Scripture and to feel peace. And ultimately, we want our kids to feel peace. We want them to be able to understand Scripture and really experience it. I want to talk for a second, just because you are of course, such a strong Christian. Just the picture of Jesus and masculinity. I love that you talk about that in your book, but he's just such a good model of being bold and being confrontational. I just read this parenting book, and it was using Jesus as a model for parenting, and that he taught God's commands, and he was unapologetically sin is a big deal, and there has to be a sacrifice, but then was so gracious and so forgiving, of course. So can you just talk about that? Because masculinity, I was talking to my friend about it the other day. If you look at the cover of magazines, it's boys and girls clothes, and it's very feminine. And then, when I was a teenager, 12 years ago, I don't know how old I am. But anyway, when I was a teenager, masculinity was rough and tough, rough and tumble, and you would never cry. But right now it's kind of switching to being more feminine. Just all of that. Talk about it all.
Well, and to your great point, we're working so hard culturally to define what it means to be masculine or feminine in this world. And my reminder to parents is it's just one more place where we don't ever want to be looking to the world to define anything. We want to be looking to God, and who is incredibly clear in his definition of what it means to be male and female. And so I think too, if we're looking at his son, the person of Jesus, as our ultimate definition of what it means to be a man in the world, it's very different than how we have defined, are defining, or likely will define what it means to be a man in this world for boys. And it is a man who was both strong and tender, a man who celebrated women, a man who was in intimate friendship with other men. That's something that I talk so much about in the strength of connection part of this book, that, we genuinely don't do a great job as adult men of modeling for boys what it looks like to be in intimate relationships. To your great point earlier, that I would be in the kind of friendship with men who could speak truth to me, things I might not see about myself. That if I were to ever edge into that space of dealing with some depression that I didn't recognize, that I have men in my life who've earned the right that I'm walking closely with to say, hey, I'm worried about you. I'm worried about you. I'm worried about your marriage. I'm worried about your kids, because Jesus walked in intimate relationship with other men. And so what does it look like to allow that to be our model, to allow that to define all of how we understand what it means to be a male in this world?
Gosh, that's so good.
Well, it feels needed more than ever.
It is extremely needed for sure. I just want to talk for a second, because we're talking about parents getting the help they need and healing. And of course, we're talking about anxiety, that makes people anxious. Well, I don't really want to talk about my past, or it's just going to get dredged back up. And it's true. Sometimes things get worse before they get better. But the Bible's very clear we're supposed to bring things to the light. Like there's something so powerful about sharing your story with a trusted friend, with a therapist, and just realizing, like, yes, we're not going to be perfect, but you really can experience considerable relief from depression, anxiety, if not total relief. And so can you just kind of talk about like what you've seen happen with parents that choose to do their own work?
I'd love to. And I would first say to everything you just said, I want to echo that and say, the wisdom of those old words of we will either transform our pain or we will transfer it. There is incredible truth to those words. And it has been my consistent experience in doing this work for 25 years. And I've seen, sadly, a lot of evidence of pain and brokenness that's been transferred onto kids that really wasn't ever theirs to carry, but is unfortunately belonging to a parent who's unwilling to do the work they need to do the work that they need to do. And I have also seen the opposite, which is deeply encouraging to see parents who've done their own work. In fact, I would go on record as saying that I think some of the healthiest parents I've worked with in over 2 decades of doing this work are interestingly parents who've been in recovery for some time. And I think there's something to daily being about a practice where I acknowledge I'm a sinner. Mm-hmm. I need God and I need community. Like if we started every day from that place, that was square one for every one of us. What a healthy way to live in this world, to acknowledge my brokenness, to acknowledge my need for God and others. And so I would say it's fascinating to watch parents who've done some extensive work, their own work, not transfer that onto their kids and operate from this place of wisdom and awareness. They're more responsive and less reactive has been my experience. And parents who haven't, the thing that both of us know well, and I say to parents often in my work is that, this arena of parenting is going to hold you hostage to more joy and more sadness than you have ever experienced in your life. That thing we all say, like, I never knew I could love another person this much. And what that means is my heart is going to be broken in this process, and I'm going to experience the deepest joy as well. And to the degree that I have a space and a place and relationships to really contend with that, to work through that, to name that, I'm going to be a healthier person in all of my relationship, not just in my parenting, but in my marriage and my friendships as well. So I couldn't challenge parents enough. And as a part of where I'm thankful our kids are growing up in a time where there isn't that stigma attached to counseling in the way it was 20, 30, 40, 50 years ago. So I get really excited about that for kids growing up in this day and time to have that kind of backdrop.
I was trained as a family systems therapist, and so it was just fascinating because it literally was the definition of social science. Like I was like, oh, this is really like a science. Like if you do this is what's going to happen in your family. And so even though it can be scary, just remember that it's a wonderful tool because ultimately we want kids that had good childhoods. We want them to have good memories of their family. And I used to work at Meyer clinics, and Dr. Meyer would say that whenever someone prays, they're praying, dear heavenly version of my earthly father. And it's a lot of pressure. You can feel it as pressure and responsibility, or that can excite us. Like we have a great, great calling, and luckily, in this day and age, we have tons of tools like your great book to help us. Like, thank goodness we're living in today where we know about these things. Yes. So we're coming to a close. Can you just tell our audience how they can connect with you and hear about all your great resources and buy the book?
You could find all of my work at raisingboysandgirls.com. And if you were to go to that website, it will take you to our podcast, and we're currently in season 5 of our podcast. It would take you to all of the books we've written, the resources that we have. It will also take you to our Instagram account where we are pushing out a lot of free content for parents. So we're trying to offer as much helpful content and resources to parents as possible. So thank you that you'd even give me a chance to talk about that today.
Oh, of course.
Tell you how much I have enjoyed just being in conversation with you and how thankful I am for the work you're doing in this world.
Oh, well, I'm thankful for you. Thank you so much for being on this show. Thanks for tuning in to Unapologetic. Remember that you can hear today's episode and more at ptv.org/Julia and wherever you get your podcasts.